Fort Construction. I'm the Director of Operations. We'll just take a quick walk and talk and take a look at kind of where we're at in the phase on this phase of Mystic Winds Court.
Yes, sir.
So we start with our pad prep. They bring in our big loaders and we level off the pad, make sure we're pretty even in it, and we meet the plat plan. Concrete guys come in and start setting first forms. What I like to call first forms. They leave a space open for the plumber to come in next, and then we do our rough in. So the plumber's going to use the plans based on where the forms are set and determine where the interior wet walls, the interior walls that have plumbing in it, and the exterior, drains and water lines, supplies, etc. Then once we pass our rough plumbing inspection, the plumber comes back in and backfills and covers up that plumbing, and then the concrete guys come back in and they start doing our final forms and our foundation prep. So they'll finish all of the perimeter forms to be able to pour the concrete, and they'll dig all of these footers you see here that are per the specified for the plans.
Okay.
Then we have that inspected, so we've got steel rebar in the footers and the load-bearing footers,
right.
Where we have load-bearing walls that will sit on top of them. And then once they're done, we call in for inspection, or preferably right before they're done, so we know we can kind of shave a day off if we can.
Right.
And then once the inspector approves that foundation prep, we try to pour within a week typically. So we'll generally kind of know when we submit for inspections, we're kind of shooting to already have a pour date scheduled.
Right.
So that's kind of what it'll get us to where we've got a concrete foundation.
Great. Now, do the inspectors get out pretty quick when you need them?
So I think typically for Doña Ana County, it's a little different in the city. But Doña Ana County, they try to keep it to a 48-hour window.
Wow. Okay.
Part of that depends on their workload and how busy, how many permits or inspection requests are submitted. But typically, inspectors try to get to all of the inspections requested within 48 hours.
Wow, that's good.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty fast. Really.
Right. It is, absolutely. Yeah. We've been a little bit here and there. I mean, sometimes technology always doesn't work like the way you want it to, and we're checking to make sure they got the inspection request. But yeah, typically, I'm expecting to follow up after about 48 hours.
Gotcha.
And the great thing about a smaller town is everybody knows everybody.
Yeah.
And we can make a phone call and say, hey man, can you just pop over and take a look? And I know, the website didn't document the inspection, but I know you called it in. Let's go take a look and make sure everything's square. And and so yeah, that's kind of where we get to to get to pouring concrete.
Very good.
Yep.
Very
so that's the.
So we think maybe next week they'll be ready to pour, but everything just depends on weather, and
right.
We get surprise rains now and then, and
labor force, rain, equipment. I think I'm sure maybe a lot of people haven't heard, but the trades are typically underserved right now anyway. So,
right.
And I mean, COVID isn't shutting things down, but people people treating the way, like when people get sick and letting people stay at home is a factor to be considered. That didn't used to be.
Right.
The trades where he just worked through it. Now when people get sick, we don't make them come to work, and so that tends to be a little bit of a slowdown as well. If guys call in sick and the whole crew's been working together, then sometimes we have some delays like that as well.
Sure.
We try to be more patient with that just because we understand. I think everybody has a different understanding of what it means to get sick now.
Right.
But anyway, to get back to that, typically we go, we try to factor in some delay days, what I would call delay days, expected delay days. We know that we're not going to be able to stack it on, and right now we're going through like what we get in the spring here, as you know, is the wind.
Yes.
And so the wind is a big issue. Not so much with pouring concrete, but let's say for other factors. And so sometimes if we have delays, even with other preceding or subsequent trades on another project that isn't even ours, that's going to affect our project, right? If another builder is using the same trade partner and they're held up 5 days because of wind and they can't pour their front driveway and the stucco guy can't finish, well, then everybody's going to get held up. So, delay days, expected delay days are a thing,
sure.
They're a factor. But yeah, typically that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of getting to having the concrete poured.
Well, better to take a little longer than to get in a hurry, right?
I 100% agree. I mean, yeah. I'm never looking to stop the project, but I try to be pretty clear with our customers. If given the choice between cutting a corner to keep it on track or slowing down to make sure it's done right, I'd rather make sure it's done right.
Absolutely.
And I think what's the old adage? If you can't afford to do it once, you can't afford to do it twice.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, I think it's got to be done square, plumb, and true. That's just how we need to build
right.
it. So
right.
So I think quality is is of the utmost importance. You know, building it, being able to build it per plans, or being able to document the way things need to be built, or specifications, selections, making sure it's done right the first time it just goes easier. You know, and I think sometimes that's where it might appear to be. It's actually slower to hurry up and have to do it twice.
I agree.
You know,
I agree. Yeah.
You know, so what did they say? Slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
You know what? You read my mind.
It's a
down,
marksmanship.
Man.
Yeah, it's a marksmanship phrase, right?
Yeah.
Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. I mean, I think getting in a rhythm and looking out ahead and trying to plan as best as we can. I mean, construction always throws you curveballs, right?
Sure.
But you want to try to plan for those as much as you can and give yourself some lead time. And so yeah, I mean, but like I said, right now the wind's been killing us, but it's as far as keeping things moving, that's kind of what gets us to pouring that concrete is that foundation prep, those inspections. And again, if the inspectors are behind and we're delayed, can't really poke those guys in the eye. You got to make friends with them.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, they kind of hold the keys to the kingdom, unfortunately.
Yes, so once you get concrete poured, then you got to give it some time. With the weather the way it is now, how long is it time-wise for it to be dry enough for you to begin to work?
That's a good question.
Roughly.
I'm not a concrete engineer. I'm not a structural engineer. Right. But to my understanding, there's some calculations that you can figure on. I think it's basically hitting about 75% of the desired PSI within, I think, the first couple weeks.
I see.
Some would say 30 days. I mean, we're talking about in a residential situation. We typically, just with, again, factoring our lead times and our scheduling, we usually try to plan about 2 weeks to 4 weeks.
Okay.
Is typically what we do. Sometimes if we're in a hurry, we'll call for a high early, or essentially request like a higher PSI requirement. If like, let's say it's an extenuating circumstance and we got to pour it and then start framing like 3 days later, then we're going to request a higher PSI in the concrete, so that way we can start framing earlier, right? Sure. PSI being the density, like the load that how much weight you can put on that concrete, you know.
Yeah, kind of like your slump test and
exactly,
and all of that,
exactly.
Your viscosity of the
sure,
concrete.
To some degree.
There's a heck of a lot to it that people just don't realize.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's where as being as working for the general builder, but us being the GBs, having specialized trade partners is kind of what allows us to be able to do the more custom homes. And like back in the day, there was more frame to finish contractors, you know, like individual contractors who had a small crew who did everything.
Right.
They poured the concrete, they framed the walls, they pulled the wire, and it coming from California, general builders could actually, you know, do electrical, mechanical, and plumbing. Sure. Whereas in New Mexico they don't allow that. But I think that's where having specialized trades that's all they do. Like my concrete guy, all he does is concrete. You know, the plumber, all he does is plumbing. And so having specialized trade partners allows us to actually not only plan and try to get everything done, but also I think hit a little bit of a higher quality. Yeah. And that isn't to say that the frame to finish guys can't. It's just that when somebody only does concrete, they're going to know a lot more about just concrete than someone who does concrete and plumbing and electrical and framing and everything else. You know.
Yeah. Jack of many trades.
Jack of all trades, master of none.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a second part of that phrase, and I forget what it is, but it actually implies the opposite. I'll have to find it. I'll send it to you. Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, but in terms of being able to kind of frame on green concrete, that they would call it, we haven't really seen it. We haven't had any issues in terms of having to wait like 60 days or 90 days. That isn't something that we typically have out here.
And it's warming up a little bit now. We're in the spring, so obviously it dries a little faster when it's warmer.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think weather obviously is going to affect anything that's curing. Yeah. I mean, when concrete is mixed, it's actually partly a chemical reaction. It's going to produce heat as a byproduct. True. So typically, I mean, you might see some issues with like what you would call delaminating or checking on the top of the concrete in really cold weather. And that's something that it's really just surface, so long as it's not exposed, stained concrete. It's just superficial, it's aesthetic, it's not structural. Sure. Right. And then in terms of the heat, sometimes depending on the weather, if it's really hot, we'll actually, after they pour, we'll actually mound up dirt all around the perimeter and flood the pad. And it just helps, it helps slow down that cure time. And part of it is you know, if it's real windy and it's real hot, that top's going to cure different than the rest of the slab.
Right.
And so you want to try to slow down the top from curing too much, so you don't get too much of that superficial cracking. And the other thing to take in mind with that is that you have your structural footers. So even though the concrete is monolithic, meaning that what's poured in between, so you have your footer here, and you have what would be the slab area here. Even though it's poured monolithic, all is one piece. Really, the footers are what's holding the weight.
Sure.
And so the concrete's really only holding the weight of itself and maybe some tile. And so in terms of getting in, I like to say, I've heard there's two kinds of concrete that's cracked and concrete that's going to crack.
Yeah.
You're going to get some superficial cracking, especially when you have penetrations coming up to the concrete. It's just almost inevitable at times.
Sure.
We run some control joints to be able to control where it's going to crack. But at the end of the day, it doesn't affect it structurally, because what you have is the structural footers with steel in it that meet an engineered specification to be able to hold that weight. So that's kind of a misnomer I was going off on, but
I love it. No, that's great information, you know, and it means a lot to know that you know what you're doing.
Or we're trying, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I mean, building science is a thing, and over the last 10-15 years, I mean, a lot more builders have started to take building science more seriously.
Right.
And I think understanding, I mean, a lot of excuse my French, the old timers might have understood it intuitively.
Yeah.
But I think being able to understand and regurgitate some of this building science information helps people feel comfortable knowing that what they're like, why they're getting what they're getting,
right,
and what matters and what doesn't. I mean, I think especially you get into custom homes, I mean, because it's their Super Bowl. This is a big project, and it's there's a lot that goes into it, and so but if you don't understand, sometimes something that may be, I don't want to say insignificant, but may not be a flaw or an issue, might seem like a flaw or an issue if you just don't understand.
Right.
Like, how do I know what's important and what isn't important to worry about, right?
Exactly. Very true.
And so I think trying to help guide our customers through that process to understand what does matter, right?
Right.
There's another phrase in the trades. It's not a mistake if you can't fix it.
Right.
Right. And so sometimes, especially going through COVID, with delays in materials, and a lot of the factors that are outside of our control, we've even kind of, sometimes you have to, quote unquote, build out of order. You know, there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat.
Sure.
And so if you're faced with, I mean, I think that's where understanding how all of the components go together allow you to sometimes maneuver through some of those uncontrolled issues and still be able to make some progress, even though it may seem out of order, right? And if we can explain that to the customer so they understand, it goes from seeming like an issue to not really being an issue.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Something's being accomplished.
Right.
May not seem the typical or what you would naturally think is
Right.
the order.
Right.
But it's work being done.
Right.
And then when the time is right, you get back to what
Right.
you had to skip
Exactly.
temporarily.
Absolutely.
Got it.
Yep.
Got it.
Absolutely.
So after the concrete is ready to go, then it's time for framing?
Pretty much. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. We're typically, even in this stage, you know, we're communicating with our truss manufacturers. So we don't, in this part of in New Mexico, especially down here, I don't know how they do it in Albuquerque, but framers don't typically cut in their own roofs.
Okay.
So we have pre-engineered trusses that are manufactured off-site and then brought in and dropped.
Gotcha.
And so after the framers put the walls up, so in this phase, and I'm jumping a little bit out of order, but in this phase, even we're having those conversations and fine-tuning and making sure those trusses are built to fit on top of the walls and not hang over or not hang in. And
right.
And so a lot of times, and it kind of on another point, sometimes something isn't happening on site, but we are actually working on that project.
Absolutely.
So and even for this one, just to kind of be transparent, there was a couple inch discrepancy in the plans on this project.
Okay.
And it to me insignificant in terms of where a wall needed to be, but I've got I think 2 or 3 inches wider in that back powder bathroom.
Okay.
And so I just had a conversation with the truss manufacturer, my engineer, and he said, hey, just field measure it. Let's just make sure it's on the right spot, so that way when I make them, they're gonna land on the walls where we want.
Yep.
That room being 2 inches bigger is no big deal.
Right.
Hey, you get a free 2 inches of room.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Pretty insignificant.
Right.
Could have been a big issue if the trusses fit inside the walls instead of landing on top of them, right?
Right.
So we're kind of adjusting and working to continue to land where we need to land.
And if you weren't aware of that,
right,
then they would have come, and then it
Right.
would have been, now what do we do? And then
Right.
you got to do some modifications on site.
exactly.
And you caught it ahead of time.
Or we have a truss modification, so I have to wait
Wow.
for another truss to get made. And I mean, and there's limitations on how I can modify my pre-engineered trusses,
Right.
Because it's engineered with a certain way.
Yeah,
And a lot of these where I have essentially my truss landing on, and we can walk over there, I guess.
I'll walk you.
But if my trusses are going to land on both of the walls, I'll make them, we'll have them be trimmable.
Yeah.
So I've got a certain amount of depth on either side of the end of those trusses that would land, let's say here and over there, that I can trim to fit to make sure I don't have to order a whole new truss.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have some tolerances.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Can it
not
be
good.
modified? Is it designed to be modified?
Right,
And to
right.
what extent can it be modified? So you have those tolerances. And I mean,
Sure.
we're not building in a laboratory. This
Right.
isn't a microchip, right? We're in the field. There's wind. There's all kinds of factors to take into consideration, and so
Yeah.
we have those tolerances we need to be within. But nothing's ever going to land on the 32nd because it's just it's built in the field.
Sure.
Built by humans, designed by humans. All of those factors.
Exactly.
As long as we know what tolerances we can work within, then there's a way to be able to work within them without
Right.
at times delaying the project.
Right.
So, but anyway, for framing, yeah, we'd have the lumber pack dropped,
Mm-hmm.
we'd have the trusses dropped. Our framer loves it when we have everything dropped at the same time.
Yeah.
And most of the time that works out. And then they go to town, they start building the exterior and interior walls. We'll get them sheathed. We
Yeah.
get our OSB sheathing on it, which gives us our structural rigidity, and then they'll start rolling the trusses, stacking the roof on top.
Sounds great,
Yep.
man.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, I want to really thank you. I want to shake
Sure.
your hand. I want to thank
Absolutely.
you for your time. It was great to meet you, and
Likewise.
you'll see me out here.
Sure. There we go.
So
Yep.
anyway, thank you so much.
No
Tell
problem.
Kelly I said-